Ranger's Apprentice, Book 2, The Burning Bridge, by John Flanagan. Chapter 12. Sir Mantech kept Alice waiting for over an hour before deigning to receive her. Halt and Alice waited in the anteroom to Mantech's office. Halt stood to one side, leaning impassively on his longbow. Mantech was an oaf, he thought. As a courier on official business, Alice should have been greeted without delay. Obviously aware of her youth, the master of corporate keep was attempting to assert his own importance by treating her as everyday messenger. He watched the girl approvingly as she sat, straight-backed and erect in one of the hard chairs in the anteroom. She appeared calm and unflustered in spite of the insult she was being offered. She had changed from her riding clothes when they were a few kilometers from the castle, and she was now dressed in a simple but elegant white gown of the courier. The bronze laurel branch pin, the symbol of her authority, fastened a short blue cape at her right shoulder. For his part, Halt had left his distinctive mottled ranger's cloak folded on the pommel of Evelyn's saddle. His longbow and quiver, however, he retained. He never went anywhere without them. Alice glanced up at him, and he nodded, almost imperceptibly, to her. "Don't let him make you angry." She returned the nod, acknowledging the message. Her hands, which were clenched into fists on her knees, slowly relaxed as she took several deep breaths. This girl is very good, Halt thought. Mantech's secretary had obviously been well briefed by his master. After peremptorily waving Alice to a chair and leaving Halt to stand, he had busied himself with paperwork and resolutely ignored them, rising several times to take items on to the inner office. Finally, at the sound of a small bell tinkling from beyond the door, he looked up and gestured towards the office. You can go in now," he said disinterestedly. Alice frowned slightly. Protocol dictated that a courier should be probably announced, but the man obviously had no intention of doing so. She rose gracefully and moved towards the door, Halt following. That got the secretary's attention. "You can wave here, Forrester," he said rudely. Without the cloak, there was little to distinguish Halt from a yeoman. He was dressed in simple brown leggings, soft leather boots, and a green surcoat. The double-knife scabbard had apparently escaped the secretary's notice, or perhaps he didn't realize its significance. "He's with me," Alice said. The unmistakable tone of authority in her voice stopped the man cold. He hesitated, then rose from behind the desk and moved towards Halt. "Very well, but you'd better leave the bow with me," he said, without quite the certainty that he displayed earlier. He held out his hand for the bow, then met Halt's eyes. He saw something very dangerous there, and he actually flinched. All right. Keep it if you must," he muttered. He backed away more than a little flustered, retreating behind the secure bulk of his desk. Halt opened the door for Alice, then followed her as she entered the office. Mantech of Cobram was seated at a large oaken table that served as a desk. He was studying a letter and didn't look up from it as Alice approached. Halt was willing to bet that the letter was about something totally unimportant. The man was playing silly mind games, he thought. But Alice was up to the challenge. She stepped forward and produced a heavy scroll from her sleeve, slapped it briskly down on the table before Mantech. He started in surprise. Looking up, Halt hid a smile. "Alice Mainwaring, Sir Mantech, courier from Redmond Castle. My credentials." Mantech wasn't just an oaf, Halt thought. He was a fop as well. His satin doublet was formed in alternating quarters of scarlet and gold. His reddish blonde hair was left in overlong curls, framing a somewhat chubby face, slightly bulging blue eyes, and a petulant mouth. He was of average height, but of somewhat more than average weight. He would be passably handsome, Halt supposed, if he could shed a few kilos in weight. But the man obviously liked to indulge himself. He recovered now from his momentary surprise and leaned back in his chair, adopting a languid, slightly disapproving tone. "Good heavens, girl, you can't come in here throwing your credentials on a desk like that. Don't they teach you good manners at Redmond Castle these days?" He looked distastefully at the scroll and shoved it to one side. "They teach protocol, Sir Mantech," Alice replied very evenly, "and it requires that you examine and acknowledge my credentials before we proceed." Yes, Mantech said, waving a dismissive hand at the scroll. Take it as read, take it as written. Now, girl, what brings you here?" All interjected quietly. "The correct form of address, Sir Mantech, is Lady Alice." Mantech looked at Halt in genuine surprise, as if he considered him some lower form of life who lacked the ability to speak. Is that so, Forrester? And what might your name be? Alice went to speak, but a warning glance from Halt stopped her. He replied, still in a quiet tone. Some people call me Apprentice, said Mantech. It's Gallican, he added mildly. Mantech raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. Gallican, you say? How exotic! Well, Master Apprentice, perhaps you could leave the talking to me and young Alice here. That would suit you. Halt shrugged, and Mantech took the movement for assent. Wonderful. Then dismissing Halt, he turned his attention back to Alice. So, sweetheart, what do you have for me? A letter, perhaps? Some self-important note from fat Baron Errol, I'll be bound? There were 2 small spots of color in Alice's cheeks, the only outward sign of the anger that was building up inside her at the man's offhand manner. She produced Nigel's heavy linen envelope from the satchel she wore at her side and offered it across the desk. I have an official legal position prepared under Baron Errol's seal. He requests that you study it. Mantech made no move to take the letter. Set it down, I'll look at it when I have time. The Baron requests that you look at it now, sir, and give me your answer. Mantech rolled his eyes to heaven and took the envelope. Oh, very well, if it'll make you happy. He sliced the envelope and took out the sheet of parchment inside it, skimming through it, muttering to himself, yes, seen it, heard it before. Nonsense, rubbish, nonsense. He set the page down and pushed it away from him, shaking his head wearily. When will you people learn? You can send me all the letters you like. The fact remains, Cobram is an independent whole, owing no allegiance to Redmond Fief. The treaty makes that very clear. I'm instructed to draw your attention to items 3 and 5 in the letter, sir, and also paragraph 9. They make it quite clear that the wording of the treaty is faulty and your claim to independence is totally spurious, Alice replied. And now for the first time Mantech shed the air of world weariness that he'd assumed. He stood angrily. Spurious? Spurious? Who the devil are you? A little girl in a grown-up's dress? To come here and insult me and saying my claim is spurious? How dare you? Alice stood her ground, unmoving by her sudden anger. I repeat, sir, you are requested to read those items, she said. Instead, Mantech threw the letter down on the desk between them. And I refuse, he shouted. Then his eyes narrowed. I know who's behind this. I see the hand of that sour-faced shrew Lady Pauline here. Now Alice's own anger fled. You will speak respectfully of Lady Pauline, sir, she warned him, but Mantech was too angry to stop. I'll speak of her all right. I'll tell you this. She's a woman meddling in a man's world where she has no place. She should have found a husband years ago and raised a brood of squalling babies. Surely there's a deaf and half-blind man somewhere who would have taken her. Sir, said Alice, her own voice rising, you're going too far. Is that right, sweetheart? Mantech replied sarcastically. Well, let me give you some advice. Get away from that shrill-pinched face, which while you have the time. Find a husband and learn to cook. That's all women are good for, cooking and raising the babies. Halt stepped forward before Alice could reply. The correct form of address, he repeated quietly, is not girl or sweetheart. It is Lady Alice. You will show respect for her the laurel branch this courier wears, and you will show respect for Lady Pauline as well. For a moment, Mantech was too startled to reply. First a girl, now a common forester, had told him how to behave. Oh, is that so? He raged. I'll show you respect. He picked up the letter and tore it in half. Then he did the same thing to the scroll bearing Alice's credentials. There's my respect. Now get out. Very carefully, Halt set his long bow to one side, leaning it against a chair. Alice raised a warning hand. Halt, don't get into trouble on my behalf, she said. But Halt looked at her and shook his head. Lady Alice, this fop has insulted you, your baron, your mentor, and the diplomatic corps as a whole. He has shown absolute disregard for the laurel branch you wear, and by destroying your credentials, he has committed a crime that warrants a jail term. Alice considered his words for a second or two. Then she nodded. Mantech had been more than rude to her. His behavior was totally beyond acceptance. "You're right," she said. "Carry on." But Mantech had heard nothing after the word halt. The entire kingdom knew the legendary ranger's reputation, and the keeper of Corbram paused now and stepped back as a grim-faced figure came towards him. But you said your name was..." He struggled to remember it. Halt smiled at him. It was the smile of a wolf. "Arate?" "Yes, well, more correctly Aratess. It's Gallican for halt. My pronunciation has never been good." His hand shot forward and locked in the scarlet and gold collar of the man's doublet. The satin tore momentarily, then Halt gained a firmer grip and dragged the struggling knight across the table towards him. Mantech was taller and heavier than Halt, but Halt's hands and arms, shoulders and backs were conditioned by years of drawing a massive longbow with its full weight of 60 kilos. The thousands of arrows he had shot over and over again had turned his muscles into steel cord. Mantech was dragged off his feet, hoisted across his own desk. "The question is," said Halt, glancing at Alice, "what should we do with him?" She hesitated. Then that wonderful smile spread over her face. "I wonder, does this castle have a moat?" A group of servants were busy emptying the privy buckets into the moat when they were startled by a sudden drawn-out cry. They looked up in time to see a scarlet and gold-clad figure sail out of a first-story window, turn over once, and then land with an enormous splash in the dark, rancid waters. They shrugged and went back to work. "I suppose I'll be back in trouble again now," Halt said as they were riding home. Alice glanced at him. He didn't look very repentant. "I doubt it. Once people hear my report, I should think that they'll say Mantech got off lightly. After all, phrases like Fat Baron Errol and Sour-faced Shrew won't exactly endear him to Baron Errol or Lady Pauline. And he did sign an acceptance of the letter in the end. As the official courier on this mission, I thank you for your service." He bowed slightly from the saddle. "It's been a pleasure working with you," he said, and they rode in companionable silence for a while. "I suppose you'll be leaving with the army soon," she said after a few minutes, and when Halt nodded, she continued, "I'll miss you. How will I ever carry out diplomatic missions without someone to throw unpleasant nobles out the window?" "I'll miss you too," Halt smiled, and he realized that he meant it. He enjoyed being around young people, enjoyed their energy, their freshness, their idealism. You're a good influence on the jaded old bad-tempered ranger. "You'll soon have Will back to keep you busy," she said. "You really miss him, don't you?" The ranger nodded. "More than I realized," he said. Alice urged her horse close beside his and leaned over to kiss him on the cheek. "That's for Will when you see him." A ghost of a smile touched Halt's face. "You'll understand if I don't pass it on in person, right?" he said. Alice smiled and leaned over to kiss him again. "And that's for you, you jaded, bad-tempered old ranger." A little surprised by her own impulsiveness, she urged her horse ahead of him. Halt touched one hand to his cheek and looked after the slim blonde figure. "If I were 20 years younger," he began. Then he sighed and had to be honest with himself. "Make that 30 years, he thought. Chapter 13. If she hadn't spoken, they would have taken her for a boy. It was the soft voice that gave her away. She stood at the edge of the campsite, a slender figure with blonde hair cut short to a boy's length, dressed in a rag tunic, breeches and soft leather boots, bound up to the knee. A stained and torn sheepskin vest seemed to be her only protection against the cold mountain nights, for she wore no cloak and carried no blankets, just a small bandana tied into a bundle, which presumably contained all her belongings. "Where the devil did you spring from?" Gilan asked, turning to face her. He sheathed his sax knife as he did so, and allowed Carney to fall gratefully to his knees, exhausted. The girl, who Will could now see, was around his own age, and underneath a liberal coating of dirt, remarkably pretty, gestured vaguely. "Oh," she paused, uncertainly trying to gather her thoughts, and Will realized she was close to the point of exhaustion. "I've been hiding out in the hills for several weeks now," she said finally. Will had to admit, she looked as if she had been. "Do you have a name?" asked Gilan, not unkindly. He too could see the girl was worn out. She hesitated. She appeared uncertain as to whether to give them her name or not. "Evelynn Wheeler from Greenfield Fief," she said. Greenfield was a small coastal fief in Ireland. We were here visiting friends." She stopped and looked away from Gilan. She seemed to be thinking for a second before she amended the statement. "Rather, my mistress was visiting friends when the Walkers attacked." "Walkers?" Will said. The word jerked from him, and she turned a level pair of brilliant green eyes upon him. As he looked into them, he realized she was more than pretty. Much, much more. She was beautiful. Strawberry blonde hair and green eyes were complemented by a small straight nose and a full mouth that Will thought would look quite delightful if she was smiling. But right now, a smile was a long way from the girl's thoughts. She gave a sad little lift of her shoulders, and she answered him. "Where did you think all the people have gone?" she asked him. "Walkers have been attacking towns and villages throughout this part of Celtica for weeks now. The Celts couldn't stand against them. They were driven out of their homes. Most of them escaped to the southwest peninsula, but some were captured. I don't know what's happened to them." Gilan and the two boys exchanged looks. Deep down, they'd all been expecting to hear something of the kind. Now it was out in the open. "I thought I saw Morgrave's hand behind all of this," Gilan said softly, and the girl nodded, tears forming in her eyes. One of them slid down her cheek, dragging its way through the grime there. She put a hand to her eyes, and her shoulders began to shake. Quickly, Gilan stepped forward and caught her just before she fell. He lowered her gently to the ground, leaning her against one of the rocks that the boys had positioned around the fireplace. His voice was gentle and compassionate now. "It's all right there. You're safe now. Just rest here and we'll get you something hot to eat and drink." He glanced quickly at Horace. "Get a fire going, please, Horace. Just a small one. We're fairly sheltered here, and I think we can risk it. And Will," he added, raising his voice so it carried clearly, "if that bandit makes another move to get away, would you mind shooting him through the leg?" Corny, who had taken the opportunity created by Evelyn's surprising appearance to begin crawling quietly away toward the surrounding rocks, now froze where he was. Gilan threw an angry glare at him, then revised his orders. "On second thoughts, you do the fire, Will. Horace, tie those two up." The two boys moved quickly to the task he had set them. Satisfied that everything was in hand, Gilan now removed his own clothes and wrapped it around the girl. She had covered her face with both hands, and her shoulders were still shaking, although she made no noise. He put his arms around her and murmured gently, reassuring her once more that she was safe. Gradually, her silent, racking sobs diminished, and her breathing became more regular. Will, engaged in heating a pot of water for a hot drink, looked at her in some surprise as he realized that she had fallen asleep. Gilan motioned for silence and said quietly, "She's obviously been under a great strain. It's best to let her sleep. You might prepare one of those excellent stews that Halt taught you to make." In his pack, Will carried a selection of dried ingredients that, when blended together in boiling water and simmered, resulted in delicious stews. They could be augmented by any fresh meat and vegetables that the travelers picked up along the way, but even without them, they made a far tastier meal than the cold rations the three had been eating that day. He set a large bowl of water over the fire, and soon had a delicious beef stew simmering and filling the cold evening air with its scent. At the same time, he produced a dwindling supply of coffee, and set the enamel pot full of water, and hot embers to the side of the main fire. As the water bubbled and hissed to a boiling, he lifted the lid to the pot with a forked stick and tossed in a handful of grounds. Soon the aromatic scent of fresh coffee mingled with the stew, and their mouths began to water. Around the same time, the savory smells must have penetrated Evelyn's consciousness. Her nose twitched delicately, then those startling green eyes flicked open. For a second or two there was alarm in them as she tried to remember where she was. Then she caught sight of Gilan's reassuring face, and she relaxed a little. "Something smells awfully good," she said, and he grinned at her. "Perhaps you could try a bowlful and then tell us what's been going on in these parts." He made a sign to Will to heap an enamel bowl full of stew. It was on bowl, as they didn't have any spare eating utensils. His stomach growled as he realized he'd have to wait until Evelynn had finished eating before he could. Horace and Gilan, of course, simply helped themselves. Evelynn began wolfing down the savory stew with an enthusiasm that showed she hadn't eaten in days. Gilan and Horace also said to eat quite happily. A whining voice came from the far rug, where Horace had tied the two bandits, setting them back to back. "Can we have something to eat, sir?" asked Carney. Gilan barely paused between mouthfuls and threw a disdainful glance at them. "Of course not," he said, and went back to enjoying his dinner. Evelynn seemed to realize that aside from the bandits, only Will wasn't eating. She glanced down at the plate and spoon she was holding, looked at the identical implements being used by Gilan and Horace, and seemed to realize what was happening. "Oh," she said, looking apologetic at Will. "Would you like to—" She offered the enamel plate to him. Will was tempted to share it with her, but realized that she must be nearly starving. In spite of her offer, he could see that she was hoping he'd refuse. He decided that there was a difference between being hungry, which he was, and starving, which she was, and shook his head, smiling at her. "You go ahead. I'll eat when you've finished." He was a little disappointed when she didn't insist, but went back to wolfing down great spoonfuls of the stew, pausing occasionally for a deep draught of hot, freshly brewed coffee. As she ate, it seemed that a little color returned to her cheeks. She cleaned the plate and looked wistfully at the stew pot still hanging over the fire. Will took the hint and ladled out another healthy dollop of stew, and she said to once again, hardly pausing to breathe. This time, when the plate was empty, she smiled shyly and handed it back to him. "Thanks," she said simply, and he ducked his head awkwardly. "It's all right," he mumbled, filling the plate again for himself. "I suppose you were pretty hungry." "I was," she agreed. "I don't think I've eaten properly in a week." Gilan hitched himself onto a more comfortable position by the small fire that kept burning. "Why not? I would have thought there was plenty of food left in the houses. You could have taken some of that." She shook her head, her eyes showing the fear that had gripped her for the previous few weeks. "I didn't want to risk it. I didn't know if there'd be more of Morgoth's patrols around, so I didn't dare go into any of the towns. I found a few vegetables and the odd piece of cheese in some of the farmhouses, but precious little else." "I think it's time you told us what you know about the events here," Gilan told her, and she nodded in agreement. "Not that I know much. As I said, I was here with my mistress, visiting friends." Again, there was just the slightest hesitation in her voice. Gilan frowned slightly, noticing. "Your mistress is a noble lady, I take it? A knight's wife, or perhaps a lord's wife?" Evelynn nodded. She is daughter to Lord and Lady Cameron of Greenfield Fief," she said quickly. But again there was that fleeting hesitating. Gilan pursed his lips thoughtfully. "I've heard the name. Can't say I know them. Anyway, she was here visiting a lady of King Sweden, an old friend, when Morgoth's force attacked." Gilan frowned once more. "How did they accomplish that?" he wanted to know. "The cliffs and the fissure are impassable. You couldn't get an army down the cliffs, let alone across the fissure." The cliffs rose from the far side of the fissure to form the boundary between Celtica and the mountains of Rain and Night. They were sheer granite, several 100 meters in height. There were no passes, no way up or down, certainly not for large numbers of troops. "Halt says no place is really ever impassable," Will put in, "particularly if you don't mind losing lives in the attempt." "We ran into a small party of Celts escaping to the south," the girl said. "They told us how the Wargals managed it. They used ropes and scaling ladders and came down the cliffs by night in small numbers. They found few narrow ledges, then used the scaling ladders to cross the fissures. They picked the most remote spot they could find, so they went undetected. During the day, those already across the fissure hid among the rocks and valleys until they had the entire force assembled. They wouldn't have needed many. King Sweden didn't keep a large standing army." Gilan made a disapproving sound and caught Will's eyes. "He should have. The treaty obliged him to. But remember what we said about people growing complacent? Celts would rather dig in their ground than defend it." He gestured for the girl to continue. "The Wargals overran the townships and mines. The mines in particular, for some reason, they wanted the miners alive. Anyone else they killed, if they didn't get away in time. Gilan rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Portelach and Gwendoleth are both totally deserted, he said. Any idea where the people have gone? If they're alive, they've gone south. The walkers seem to be driving them that way. Makes sense, I suppose, Gilan commented. Keeping them bottled up in the south would prevent word getting out to Ireland. That's what the captain of our escort said, Evelynn agreed. King Sweden and most of his surviving army retreated to the southwest coast to form a defensive line. Any Celts who managed to get away from the walkers have joined him there. And what about you? Gilan wanted to know. We were trying to escape back to the border when we were cut off by a war party. Our men held them off while my lady and I escaped. We were almost clear, but a horse stumbled and they caught her. I wanted to go back for her, but she screamed at me to get away. I couldn't. I wanted to help her, but I just... Tears began to cascade down her cheeks once more. She didn't seem to notice, making no attempt to swipe them away, just staring silently into the fire as the horror of it all came back to her. When she spoke once more, her voice was almost inaudible. I got killed here and I turned back to watch. They were... I could see them. Her voice died away. Gilan reached forward and took her hand. Don't think about it, he said gently, and she looked out at him, gratitude in her eyes. I take it that after that you got away into the hills? She nodded several times, her thoughts still vivid with the terrible scene she had witnessed. Will and Horace sat in silence. Will glanced at his friend and looked of understanding passed between them. Evelynn had been lucky to escape. I've been hiding here ever since. My horse went lame about 10 days back, and I turned him loose. Since then, I've kept moving back towards the north by night and hiding by day. She indicated Bart and Carney, sitting trussed like two captive chickens on the far side of the clearing. I saw those two a few times, and others like them. I didn't make myself known to them. I didn't think I could trust them. Carney assumed a hurt look. Bart was still too dizzy from the crack Horace had given him with the flat of his sword to be taking any interest in the proceedings. Then I saw you three earlier today from across the valley, and I recognized you as King's Rangers. Well, 2 of you anyway, she amended. All I could think was, thank God. Gilan looked up at her. At that, a small frown of concentration creased his forehead. She didn't notice the reaction as she went on. It took me most of the day to reach you. It wasn't far as the crow flies, but there was no way across the valley that separated us. I had to go the long way around, then down and up again. I was terrified that you'd be gone by the time I got here, but luckily you weren't, she added unnecessarily. Will was leaning forward, elbow on his knee and hand propped under his chin, trying to piece together all she told him. Why would Morgoth want miners, he asked of nobody in particular. He doesn't have mines, so it doesn't make sense. Maybe he's found some, Horace suggested. Maybe he's found gold up in the mountains of Rain and Night, and he needs slaves to dig it out. Gilan nodded thoughtfully at the thumbnail as he considered what Horace had said. That could be, he said last. He's going to need gold to pay off the Scandians. Maybe he's mining his own. Evelynn had set up like a little straight at the mention of the sea wolves. Scandians? Are they in league with Morgoth now? Gilan nodded. They got something cooking, he told her. The entire kingdom's on alert. We are bringing dispatches to King Sweden's from Duncan. You'll have to go southwest to find him, Evelynn replied. Will noticed that she had started a little at the mention of King Duncan's name. But I doubt he'll leave his defensive position here. Gilan was already shaking his head. I think this is more important than taking his dispatches to Sweden. After all, the main thrust of them was to tell him that Morgoth was on the move. I guess he knows that by now. He stood up, stretching and yawning. It was already full dark. I suggest we get a good night's sleep and start back north in the morning. I'll take first watch, so you can keep my cloak, Evelynn. I'll take Wolf's when he relieves me. Thank you, Evelynn said simply, and all 3 of them knew she was talking about more than just the use of the cloak. Will and Horace moved to douse the fire. Gilan took his long bow and moved to a rock outcrop that gave him a good view of the track leading to and from their campsite. As Will was helping Evelynn arrange a sleeping spot, he heard Carney's whining voice once more. Sir, could you please loosen these ropes a little for the night? They're awful tight. And he heard Gilan's uncaring, "Of course not," as he climbed up onto the rocks to take the first watch. Chapter 14. The following morning, of course, they were faced with the problem what to do with Bart and Carney. Two bandits had spent a supremely uncomfortable night, tied back to back and so forced to sit upright in the stony ground. Several times during the night, Gilan had loosened their bonds for a few minutes to give their cramped muscles a brief respite. He even eventually relented and allowed them a small amount of the party's food and water. But it was still a very unpleasant experience for them, made even more so because they had no idea what he planned to do with them in the morning. And truth be told, neither did Gilan. He had no wish to take them along as prisoners. As it was, they had only 4 horses, counting the pack horse that had been carrying their camping supplies, and would now have to carry Evelynn as well. He felt that the news of Morgoth's puzzling foray into Celtica should be taken back to King Duncan as soon as possible, and dragging 2 prisoners along on foot would slow them down immeasurably. In addition, he was already considering the idea that he might push on ahead at top speed, allowing the other 3 to follow at their own pace. He knew the clumsy pack pony would never keep up with Bliss's mile-eating lope. So faced with the 2 problems, he frowned to himself as he ate breakfast, allowing himself the luxury of a second cup of coffee from the dwindling supply. After all, he thought, if he did go on ahead, it was the last coffee he'd seen for some days. After a while, he glanced up, caught Will's eye, and beckoned him over. "I'm thinking of pushing ahead," he said quietly. Instantly he saw the look of alarm in Will's eyes. "You mean alone?" Will asked, and Gilan nodded. "This is vital news, Will, and I need to get to King Duncan as soon as possible. Aside from anything else, it means that there'll be no reinforcements coming from Celtica. He needs to know." But Will hesitated. He looked around the little campsite as if searching for some argument against Gilan's idea. The tall ranger was a comforting presence. Like Halt, he always seemed to know what the right thing to do was. Now, the thought that he was planning to leave them created a sense of near panic in Will's mind. Gilan recognized the self-doubt that was wrecking the boy. He stood and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's walk a little," he said, and they began to pace away from the campsite. Blaze and Tuck glanced up curiously as they passed, then realizing they weren't required, went back to cropping the sparse vegetation. "I know you're worried about what happened with those 4 walkers." Will stopped walking and looked up at him. "Halt told you?" There was a note of doubt in his voice. He wondered what Halt had said about his behavior. Gilan nodded gravely. "Of course he told me, Will. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Believe me. But Gil, I panicked. I forgot all my training and Gil held up a hand to stop the torrent of self-recrimination that he sensed was about to pour out. "Halt says you stood your ground," he said firmly. Will shuffled his seat. "Well, I suppose so, but you were scared, but you didn't run. Well, that's not cowardice, that's courage. That's the highest form of courage. Weren't you scared when you killed the Calcara?" "Of course," Will said. "That was different. It was 40 meters away and attacking Sir Rodney." "Where else?" Gilan finished for him. "The walker was 10 meters away and coming straight at you. Big difference." Will wasn't convinced. "It was Took who saved me," he said. Gilan allowed himself a grin. "Maybe he thought you were worth saving. He's a smart horse. And while Halt and I aren't nearly as smart as Tuck, we think you've got what it takes too." "Well, I've been beginning to doubt it," Will said. But for the first time in some weeks, he felt his confidence lift a little. "Then don't," Gilan said forcefully. "Self-doubt is a disease. And if it gets out of control, it becomes self-fulfilling. You have to learn from what happened with those walkers. Use the experience to make you stronger." Will thought about Gilan's words for a few seconds. Then he took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. "All right," he said. "What do you want me to do?" Gilan studied him for a moment. There was a newfound determination in the boy's stance. "I'm going to leave you in command. There's no point now in continuing with the mission, so follow on behind me to Ireland as quickly as you can." "To Redmond?" Will asked, and Gilan shook his head. "By now the army will be on the move to the plains of Uthal. That's where I'm heading, and that's where Halt will be. We'll go over the map before I leave and plan the best route for you." "What about the girl?" Will asked. "Should I bring her along or leave her somewhere safe once we're back in Ireland?" Gilan considered the point for a moment. "Bring her. The king and his advisors may want to question her some more. She'll be in the middle of Evelynn army, so she'll be as safe as anywhere else. He hesitated, then decided to share his suspicion with Will. There's something else about her, Will, he began. You think her story isn't quite right, Will interrupted. She keeps hesitating and stopping as if she's afraid to tell us something. Another thought struck him, and he lowered his voice instinctively, even though the campsite were well out of earshot. You don't think she's a spy, do you? Gilan shook his head. Nothing so dramatic, but remember what she said. She saw us and thought, thank God they're rangers. Ordinary people don't think that way about us. Only the nobles are comfortable around rangers. Wolfram, so you think? He hesitated. He wasn't sure what Gilan thought. I think she may be the lady, and she assumed her maid's identity. So on the one hand, she sees rangers and is glad that she doesn't trust us enough to tell of the truth. Doesn't make sense, Gil. Gilan shrugged. It may not be that she doesn't trust us. She may have other reasons for not saying who she really is. I don't think it's a problem for you. I just think you should be aware of it. They turned and began to walk back to camp. I don't like to leave you in the lurch, Gilan said, but you're not exactly unarmed. You got your bow and your knives, and of course there's Horace. Will glanced across to where the muscular apprentice was sharing a joke with Evelynn. She threw back her head and laughed. He felt a small pang of jealousy. Then he realized that he could be glad to have Horace along. He's not bad with the sword of his, is he? He said. Gilan shook his head in admiration. I'd never tell him, because it doesn't do a swordsman any good to have an inflated opinion of himself. But he's a lot better than not bad. He looked down at Will. That's not to say you should go looking for trouble. There may still be walkers between here and the border, who travel by night and hide up in the rocks by day. Gil, Will said as an awkward thought struck him. What are we going to do about those two? He jerked a thumb towards the two bandits, still tied back to back, still trying to doze off, and still jerking each other awake as they did so. That's the question, isn't it? Said the ranger. I suppose I could hang them. I do have the authority. After all, they did try to interfere with officers on the king's business, and they're looting in time of war. They're both capital offenses. He cast a gaze around the rocky hills surrounding them. The question is whether I can actually do that here, he murmured. You mean, said Will, not liking the way his friend was thinking, you may not have the authority to hang them now that we are not in the kingdom itself? Gilan grinned at him. I hadn't considered that. I was actually thinking that it'd be a bit difficult when there isn't a tree over a meter high within 100 kilometers. Will heaved a small inner sigh of relief as he realized Gilan hadn't been serious. Then the ranger grin faded, and he said warmingly, The one thing I do know is that we don't want them coming after you free again. So make no mention of my plans until we've gotten rid of them, alright? In the end, the solution was a simple one. First, Gilan had Horace break the blade of Carney's sword by levering it sharply between two rocks. Then he hurled Bart's crutchel into the ravine by the road's edge. They heard it clattering and bouncing off the rocky slope for several seconds. Once that was done, Gilan forced the two men to strip to their underwear. You needn't watch this, he told Evelynn. It won't be a pretty sight. Smiling to herself, the girl retreated inside the tent while the two men stripped down to their ragged underpants. They were shivering now in the cold mountain air. And your boots, Gilan ordered, and the two men sat awkwardly on the stony ground and removed their boots. Gilan nudged the piles of clothing with one toe. Now bundle them up and tie them in a ball with your belts, he ordered, and watched as Bart and Carney complied. When all was ready, he called Horace over and jerked a thumb at the two bundles of clothes and boots. Send them after the crotchel, Horace. Horace grinned as he began to understand. Bart and Carney understood too and started a chorus of protest. It stopped as Gilan swung an icy stare upon them. You're getting off lightly. As I mentioned to Will earlier, I could hang you if I chose to. Bart and Carney instantly went quiet. Then Gilan gestured for Horace to tie them up again. Meekly they submitted, and in a few minutes they were back to back, shivering in the keen wind that circled and dipped around the hills. Gilan considered them for a moment or two. Throw a blanket over them, he said reluctantly. A horse blanket. Will obliged, grinning. He took care not to use Tuck's blanket, but used the one belonging to the sturdy pack pony. Gilan began to saddle Blaze, speaking to the others over his shoulder. I'm going to scout around Gwyndoleth. There may be someone there who can shed a little more light on what Morgrave is up to. He looked meaningfully at Will, and the apprentice realized that Gilan was saying this to throw the two bandits off. He gave a slight nod. I should be back by about sunset, Gilan continued loudly. Try to have something hot waiting for me then. He swung up into the saddle and beckoned Will closer. Leaning down, he whispered, Leave the two tied up and head off at sunset. They'll eventually get themselves loose, but then they'll have to retrieve their boots and clothes. They won't go anywhere in these mountains without them. It'll give you a day's start over them, and that should take you clear. Will nodded. I understand. Ride safely, Gilan. The ranger nodded. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, then came to a decision. Will, we are in uncertain times, and none of us knows what might be around the corner. It might be a good idea if you told Horace's code word. Will frowned. The code word was a jealously guarded secret. He was reluctant to let anyone know it, even a trusted comrade like Horace. Seeing hesitation, Gilan continued. You'd never know what might happen. You could be injured or incapacitated. And without the code word, Horace won't be able to make Tug obey him. It's just a precaution. Will saw their sense in the idea and nodded. I'll tell him tonight. Take care, Gilan. The tall ranger leaned down and gripped his hand tightly. One other thing. You are in command here, and the others will take the lead from you. Don't give them any sign that you're not sure of yourself. Believe in yourself, and they'll believe in you too. He nudged Blaze with his knees, and the bay swung around towards the road. Gilan raised a hand in farewell to Horace and Evelynn, and cantered away. The dust of his passage was quickly dispersed by a keening wind, and then Will felt very small and very alone.